Okay, hello everyone. My name is Graeme Cooke, and I'm the host of the Tales of Britain and Ireland podcast. You probably don't care very much about that, but it's a podcast in which I tell lots of stories from all across, well, Britain and Ireland. Um, and sorry, I've just seen that somebody can't hear there. I don't just want to see if that's affecting not everybody else there. Just
I can hear you just fine, Graham. It
hear me
might be
just fine.
something, yeah, it might be something with their specific setup at their community. Sally, just make sure that your television is connected to the same sound as your laptop. Sorry, Graham. Go ahead.
That's absolutely fine. These things happen, and I wouldn't want anyone to miss out on my voice. We've got an hour of it to go, so you probably won't miss on too much if you get your setup sorted. Yes, I'm host of a podcast called Tales of Britain and Ireland. I tell tales of Britain and Ireland. Got about 50 episodes, tell all kinds of things, but I also kind of have an interest in folklore. So I'm a storyteller first, folklore, very amateur folklorist second. But in that time, I have picked up a little bit of detail about today's topic, which I've been invited very kindly by Kaylin to talk to you about. So I'm going to put a presentation up on screen, going to run through that. And then, as Kaylin was saying, any questions at the end. So without any further ado, hopefully you'll all in a second be able to see this. There we go. There's the summary of the podcast there, picture of some of the stories I've told. But today, I'm here to talk to you about the fairy folklore of Britain and Ireland. And as it says right there, it says, in the old days of King Arthur, all was this land full of fairy. And this is a bit of a theme with the fairies. That quote was written in 1392 or thereabouts by Geoffrey Chaucer. And even he was saying way back then that the fairies belonged to a time way back before then. The fairies have always seemed to be disappearing, and yet they have still stuck around. Now, because I'm a storyteller first, I'm going to start off with three beginnings to stories that we will come back to during the course of the talk. So, let's begin. It is roughly the year 1250 or thereabouts. A young man lies on a hillside in the Scottish borders under a lovely warm sun. He has a bed made of heather for him. He is the middling rich sort of guy, so he can afford a day off spent in leisure. He whistles a tune to himself, doesn't do anything in particular, but oof, what's that? In the distance, he spies a white horse in the sunlight, and astride it, a woman. And this gets Thomas's interest, even though he's, enjoying lying around. As the two get closer, he can see that they are covered both in more precious metal and exotic gemstones than he has ever seen in his life before. A golden bridle, an emerald studded saddle, tiny silver bells. Okay, this requires even more attention. Up gets Thomas, down he goes to greet the woman, who is dressed in the finest silks he has ever seen. And of course, probably goes without saying, but she is beautiful. He's almost kind of struck dumb by her beauty, tries to find his words, but she has words for him. Thomas, she says, addressing him by name, though he cannot think how she knows it. I have come for you. Now let's jump forward some 300 years or so. It's 1650, and it's about midnight in a cottage just outside a small Suffolk village. There lives one of the most regarded people in that village. She is, of course, asleep because it's midnight, but there comes a knock at the door, a loud, urgent knocking. Now, the midwife, for that's who she is not entirely unused to such late night knocking. So she is up and she is throwing on clothes and grabbing the bag that she always has ready for occasions such as this. But when she throws open the door, it's not someone she recognizes, no husband of any woman in the village she knows might be close. No, standing there is a tall man she doesn't recognize, holding a lantern. And he says to her, "I hear you are the very best." The midwife gives a little snort. She can't admit it, would never say it, but it is true. She is the very best. She knows it in her heart. And the man says, "My mistress is in dire need. She needs someone like you who is the very best." And the midwife might not know this man, but she knew her trade, knew what she had to do if a woman was in need. She stepped out into the night. Now, we jump forward again, another 300 odd years, and we're actually at the beginning of the 20th century, end of the 19th, there or thereabouts. And we are now in County Mayo, and we are at the farm of a very forward-thinking, modern, progressive farmer. And he has just decided on a place for his new barn, right in the field where the lone hawthorn tree stands. The tree had stood there for as long as he has known it, and it's just in a really inconvenient place. It's been left alone, well, all around it. The field grows, and now he wants a barn there. So he fetches an axe and a spade, and he sets to work chopping down the tree and digging it out. And as night falls, the tree is gone. He's chopped it up, little logs next to the house, and he looks at it with pride, thinking, got that job done finally, and tomorrow I'll begin work on the barn. So, 3 stories there, which might make sense in context later. I'm going to start this talk off by talking about what fairies are. And I'm going to do that for a bit of time. And the reason I'm going to do that is because, well, you've probably got a good idea of what fairies are. What do you think of when you think of fairies? Unfortunately, you can't give me responses, but if I say the word fairies, I think it's quite likely that you picture something like this. Look at them there with their little wings, small insects running around, or this, gossamer, floaty light. They're kind of women and children, diminutive little creatures, or flowers there, cutesy little things. And yet, the fairies I'm going to talk to you about today, the fairies in the folklore of Britain and Ireland for the last 2,000 years, possibly even more, are nothing at all like this. This is rather strange. There is a process by which this happened, but essentially, none of what is on the screen now, with big X's over it, is what the fairies are like. So we kind of have to deconstruct, take down this modern idea of fairies, because in the 19th century, fairies became something very different that we all know today. But actually, fairies in folklore are nothing like that at all. Before I come on to define them, I should also say that fairies are a lot of different beings. And I'm concentrating just on Britain and Ireland. There are creatures from outside our countries that could possibly be considered fairies as well. But even just here is a small selection of creatures that could be considered under the banner fairies, as well as elves, which is quite common. You've got the she from Irish mythology. You've got the Tulla Teg. You've got hobs and leprechauns and all kinds of other creatures that are considered parts of fairydom, creatures that could be considered fairies in all the different languages of these islands. So we're talking about a lot of different creatures here that obviously have their differences. But what is it if unites them, if it's not being tiny and having little wings? Well, oddly enough, to distinguish fairies from all the other kind of supernatural, mystical, mythological creatures, we start in an unusual place, which I think is the most important distinguishing characteristic from, say, dragons or ogres or other creatures. Fairies are intelligent, sentient, as intelligent as human beings, or more so, with language just the same as we have. They are also typically humanoid or human looking. They're recognizable in that 2 arms, 2 legs, and a head business. Though they can shapeshift. So though that's kind of their natural form, you might well find fairies that look like, well, all manner of things, horses and cats and houses on at least one occasion, because folklore's strange. But at their base, they're humanoid looking. That shapeshifting brings us on to the fact that they are magical. The amount to which they are magical varies depending on story and region and type. Some of them are very powerful, the sort of almost challenging the gods type power. Other of them have little kind of kitchen witch spells that can tidy up your house and everything in between. And with that magic, they can almost certainly turn invisible. The fairies can be around us and we do not know about it. That's another key aspect of them. Now, everything I've just said there could potentially be applied to witches or wizards, magical human beings with special abilities. So it's important to also say that the fairies, while having all of those characteristics, they are not human. They are distinctly something different from humans. Now, there's a whole load of fairy folklore that says that they might well once have been human. Strangely enough, and I don't have time to go into it today, there's quite a lot that suggests that they were the human dead, but now they are not human. And coming back to the key points of modern day fairies and how they differ, size-wise, fairies are indeed anything from insect size to a bit taller than regular people, but by far the most common across all these centuries of fairy folklore is that they're basically the same size as us as well. Maybe a little bit bigger. Some of them are definitely smaller, but typically about the same size. And they never have wings. Not ever. Even though sometimes they're small, they never have wings. It just isn't a thing, which is very strange. And yeah, how it got there, a bit peculiar, but they never have wings. And that's what I'm going to be talking about today. So if you're thinking about fairies, you should probably picture them like humans, but a little bit better. They're magical. They might be more beautiful and taller. They're just, you know, they can turn invisible. We can't. They are better. There's a kind of other further division it's worth thinking about when we're thinking about fairies. I'll run through this one quickly, but you have the fairies who are social. These creatures here, they all live in groups. They live together. And that's their key defining feature. They are like us, and their societies are vastly different. You have fairies who have royal courts and all their courtiers, and you have fairies who live in groups down mines and everything in between. The whole gamut of societies, but they group together. And when we talk about the fairies, there's often a lot of talk about the fairies. It's these social fairies that I mostly will be speaking about today, and that's what people mean when we say the fairies. But there is another group of beings who, well, they're solitary. And the solitary fairies are, they've gone a bit strange, like humans who have a little bit time solitary, a little bit too much time spent solitary. They're an odder looking bunch. They're often obsessed with one particular thing. You've got a Clurican at the top right of that set there, who loves booze. You've got brownies who are obsessed with cleaning houses. And you've got a strange little creature called Yallery Brown there as well. They have gone a bit weird. You can tell why the other fairies don't associate with them. Mostly I'm going to be talking about that first group there, but the solitary fairies are very definitely a part of fairies as a whole as well. And just as a reminder, they never have wings. So where can you find fairies? Well, almost everywhere is the answer to that question, but I realize that's not a very helpful answer. So they definitely congregate in areas away from humans, be that woodlands or ancient sites. These can be things like old burial chambers, Iron Age hill forts, stone circles. In Ireland, those are grouped together, known as fairy forts or raths in Irish. These places were once, their original function wasn't known, and they were thought to be the home of the fairies. They can also be found dancing in meadows, a commonplace, on mountains and hilltops. That there is a Glastonbury tour. The king of the Welsh fairies, Gwyn ap Nudd, certainly used to hold his court there. Caves is another common one. Basically, anywhere wild, a bit away from humans. But as well as that, fairies also inhabit an otherworld. And an otherworld is something that we have a lot of experience with today in our fiction through parallel worlds. And it is a little similar to that, but not quite. The otherworld, or the other worlds, probably more accurately, are places that the fairies kind of can come into our world through, that's joined to our world. The other world tends to be quite a nice place, usually. Time sometimes passes differently there, and you might get to it through certain markers. So, for instance, here you've got you've got Newgrange there as the picture, a huge barrow from Neolithic times, and that's one of the key places that the Sidhe, the Irish fairies, are said to enter the other world. And at certain times of year, people can go in too. But there are multiple other worlds. And so in Wales, the other world is more explicitly underground. And then you also have the situation where a lot of tales tell of magical islands across the sea. So these are often accessible across the Western Ocean. Remember, this is a time when we didn't know what was across the Western Ocean. You are, of course, all sitting there now, but at that time we did not. And it was thought that there lay a land of eternal youth. I can't say whether that's true or not. And you could reach it by boat or indeed by magical horse, as in the picture that's meant to be coming up next and didn't for some reason. Oh no, a head's got cut off. Or by magical horse. And also, other worlds could be found under lakes. Fairies of Welsh legends, especially, could be found under lakes. You'd go into a lake, and then at the bottom of it, somehow you journey into the other world. These weren't true parallel dimensions. They're more like the author Terry Pratchett has a nice little phrase. They say parasite dimensions, and I quite like that. They're smaller places that kind of attach to ours. And yeah, the fairies enjoy life there because it tends to be pretty good. So the fairies can be found in wild places in the other world, but also just in the air. Occasionally, you can find them in our houses. The fairies really do get around. So, I've given you a bit of a whistle-stop tour into what the fairies are there, probably at quite high level. Basically, put aside your idea of winged fairies, concentrate on them being these magical humanoid creatures, which are very intelligent as us, better than us, and live just outside of human society or in an entire other world. But that doesn't tell us much about their character. And that's what I'm going to use most of the rest of this talk to talk to you about. The most important characteristics of fairies, if you take nothing else away from this talk, I'd like you to take this, is that the fairies in folklore and legend were incredibly dangerous. Let's go back, if you remember, to our farmer in County Mayo who has cut down the hawthorn tree, stood alone in his field so he can build a new barn because he is a modern man. He's gone to bed, slept well. The next morning he is up, crack of dawn, to milk the cows. And as he leaves his house, he sees, to his quite considerable alarm, he sees a woman in his field looking at the hole from which the hawthorn has been dug. She is clad all in white, and she is weeping, and she is wailing. The farmer sort of stands there, doesn't quite know what to do, but before he can do anything else, he hears more weeping and wailing, and he turns, and there, where he has piled the logs up against the house, there are more women, all of them clad in white, all of them in a state of utter distress. The hawthorn has, of course, been left for so long because it is known to be a fairy tree. And, well, the farmer is about to find out what happens to those who touch the fairy tree. All at once, in unison, the women stop crying. They've noticed him. They look up, and with one voice, they say, "You will pay dearly for this, Tommy O'Callaghan." And he is no longer a farmer with modern ideas. He remembers what he was taught now, but it's too late. He turns, he runs back into his house, but at the threshold, he trips, he falls to the floor, and he is overcome with a fit, leaves him trembling there. His wife finds him later. She takes him up to bed. But by the next morning, he was quite dead. Fairies are very dangerous. It is the one sort of unifying strand of belief in folklore about them. This is going to take up more of the rest of the presentation because while there's a lot of different characteristics of fairies I could talk about, I think this presentation was about an hour and a half when I first wrote it, this is the one that really defines them. They can be dangerous in a huge variety of different ways. Let's start with the gentle ones here. They play tricks and pranks of a relatively harmless nature. Now, because I'm English, I'm honor-bound, oath-bound to mention Shakespeare at some point, and Shakespeare writes about fairies, so let's have a quote from Shakespeare about what they do. So, the fairies skim the cream off the milk, they clog up the flour mill, they, what does it say, make housewives breathless by keeping the milk from turning into butter, annoying when that happens. They are doing all these irritating things that are just making household tasks harder. The medieval equivalent of losing your car keys. If all this stuff's happening to you, well, it's the fairies that are doing it. Which is annoying, admittedly, but not that bad, really. So let's look at some of the other things that the fairies did. They caused crops to wither and die. They caused disease in animals. This is a quote from 1938 that says that when a cow gets sick, it often happens that the fairies are taking her. The fairies would often take horses from stables, ride them around until they were exhausted or sometimes dead. They would cause travelers to become lost. Another Shakespeare quote here of a fairy, Puck in Midsummer Night's Dream, saying how he will take travelers on a merry dance through a bog, through bush, through brake, through briar. A will-o'-the-wisp you might have heard of, a sort of a phantom light that leads people to think, oh, I'm heading to that village, it's night, I'll go there. But actually, it's not the village lights at all. And you're left to wander into a bog where back in the days, well, that was pretty disastrous. Might easily wind up very ill or indeed lose your life, especially as the fairies did in some places like to lead people to the edges of very high cliffs. They love that kind of game. Sometimes they pick people up and deposit them on the tops of hills. There was a group of fairies called the Slewer, a kind of airborne host who would pick people up and carry them away. And one story even tells how they transported someone to America by a ferry. And it gets worse than that, of course, because they could cause illness in people as well. Sudden diseases were particularly caused by the fairies. Wasting diseases that came on all of a sudden might be put down to people dancing with the fairies all night long. That there is a picture of, well, what we might call some Neolithic arrowheads. A particularly pretty set of Neolithic arrowheads there. These are sometimes found scattered around various places, especially Scotland and Ireland. And those were commonly called elf shot. People who had been shot with elf shot, how else does it get on the ground, would find themselves cause of intense pain, disfiguration. They'd be warped, have fits. Invisible fairies might pinch and scratch, leave painful bruises. And of course, the fairies, like in the story I told at the start, would just outright murder people. They weren't beyond that. Whole towns could be destroyed, buried by the fairies. A few types of fairies are even said to drink human blood and eat human flesh. So, yeah, it's not mild stuff here about the fairies at all. Now, why do they do this? The reasons are many and varied, but often simply for fun. The fairies enjoy cruelty. They are sadistic beings. But also, another reason is commonly because humans offend them in some way. Sometimes you might think that's illegitimate, like the fairies want offerings. They want humans to give them something, and if they don't get it, well, then they'll be cruel. But at other times, well, the humans might have stolen something from the fairies. They might have cut down their tree, for instance, and then the fairies might seek revenge. But I've not yet talked about the biggest fairy danger. And the biggest fairy danger by far, what they like to do most, was abduct people. And you can see two groups of people, two people being abducted by groups of fairies there. And probably the most common way that they'd abduct people is that they would take babies and leave something else behind. And interestingly enough, like I think I was saying, people tend to think that they're cute, lovely little things, the fairies. But this is one thing that we sort of actually remember, I think, as a society. This gets brought up all the time. People are aware of changelings, aware that fairies take a young baby and in its place, they will leave in a crib an aged or sickly fairy that is very unwell or wrong in other ways, something that's typically called a changeling. Now, that's well known today. A bit less well known is that commonly in the past, fairies were also said to leave an item behind that was enchanted to look like a child's corpse. Very dark stuff when we get to the fairies. So this was commonly called, it's called a stock, and it might be something like a lump of wood or some twigs tied together. But the thing is, you wouldn't know that because it looked like a corpse. And then the stock would be buried and nobody knew that the child had even been abducted unless maybe it was dug up later or something like that. It's not clear why fairies steal babies. Is it just their cruelty? Is it so that the people will raise their own young? Is it because they like bringing humans into the fairy fold? Not entirely clear, but they definitely do it. Now, interestingly, they also take adults. And this is less talked about today as well, but was very common in the past. People who encountered the fairies at night, dancing in their rings, could disappear. New mothers would be taken along with their children. This often happened in the past. As I say, less common, we talk about it now, but that's what the fairies would take, both mother and child, disappear. They liked taking musicians, they liked entertainment, they liked taking poets as well to come and perform for them. And adults too could be replaced with a changeling, a person who looked like the adults who have been taken, but might be strange, might be confused, away with the fairies. Once again, they could also be replaced with a pretend corpse that was then buried. This meant that somebody who looked like a person you might know might not be them. And that has some fairly terrifying implications, this bit of folklore. People were, in the past, accused of being fairy changelings. And in some cases, they were treated incredibly harshly, and some people were even killed because it was believed that they were a changeling. So, the fairies are very, very dangerous. But I should probably talk a little bit about the other qualities, so we'll do that, even though I do like to talk about the first one. The thing, probably the second most important quality of the fairies for you to understand, apart from their dangerousness, is that the fairies were sexy, but usually still dangerous. Let's return to that Scottish border hillside in the 13th century. Thomas has just been approached by that woman on the horse, and, well, she says, "Thomas, I want something from you." He says, "Okay, then, what's that?" Finding his words again. And she is completely straight up with it, says something which I'm going to just skip over. You can infer it from, you can infer it from what happens next, because what happens next is they do the thing that she mentions 7 times beneath a tree, which is a lot, actually, even for Thomas. And when they have done it 7 times and he's having a good time and all, she appears to be too. He actually thinks, I need a break now. Pause on this, actually. And it's only at that point that the woman reveals herself to be the queen of the fairies. Might have worked that out there. Thomas might have even worked it out himself. And also that having lain together 7 times, he now had to serve her for 7 years in Fair Elf land. And he probably says something like, "Oh, but I didn't feed my dog." Doesn't matter. She grabs him, and with her supernatural strength, she brings him up on the back of her horse, and the two of them ride off straight into the side of a mountain, and from there into the other world. They ride through blackness, they ride through lakes of blood, because the fairies are nasty, and eventually they arrive at Fair Elf land. And Thomas is not looking forward to this. A slave to the Queen of the Fairies for 7 years. And yet, after day 3, well, he's feeling pretty good about the whole thing, because all the fairies seem to do is party and hunt and, well, more of that thing that you're going to have to infer as well. And it's been 3 glorious days, better than any he's had before. And yes, he misses his friends and family and little dog and all that, but this is actually shaping up to be pretty good. And it's at that point when the Queen comes to him and says, "Thomas, my lover, yeah, it's time to go." "Sorry," says Thomas, "what?" "It's time to go, Thomas. You've been here for 7 years. 7 years? Oh, yes, 7 of your years is how long you have to serve me for. That's 3 days here." Thomas is a bit thrown by that, but once again, he's got no choice. Thrown onto the back of the horse, out he goes. The Queen deposits him back. After 7 years have passed, everyone's got older. She gives him a little consolation prize, some gifts of prophecy and the ability to play music. And the man, Thomas the Rhymer, as he goes on to be called, is left with just the sweet memories of the enchanted embrace of the Queen of the Fairies. So, the fairies were seductive. There's a fairy there being seductive. This is something that has existed for as long as there have been descriptions of elves and fairies. They are beings who have great seductive powers to mortals, us. Medieval English stories often tell of men who encountered fairy women in the woods and took them as lovers. There's some nice dancing people there. That's what you might encounter. But male fairies too could take human women as lovers. They might appear to them in their bedchambers. One tells of a fairy who was a hawk to reach his lover's tower. And by all accounts, this was fairly popular. Now, obviously, this wasn't all fairies. It wasn't those strange solitary ones, and there was a lot of fairies who weren't like this, but a goodly number of them. So what happened if you were seduced by a fairy? As this gentleman here is, that's a lake fairy, probably a Welsh one, coming out of the lake to seduce him. Well, the outcomes of seductions were many and varied. 12th century chronicler Walter Map tells of a man called Wild Edric, who took a fairy wife, and they lived together for many years as man and wife quite happily, even had a son together. But one day he got angry at her, and she simply vanished in a puff of smoke, and he withered away and died. A similar fate befell many like this gentleman in this picture here, who took lake maidens as brides. They had good lives until the man hit their wives, sometimes even unintentionally, like by accident, or they said an unkind word to them, and then, in that case, the fairy wife would, understandably enough, up and leave. Some people, however, went the other way. They would disappear into the other world forever. The earliest tale we have of the Irish fairies speaks of just this, a man named Connla, who was seduced by a fairy maiden that only he could see and disappeared off to the other world in the West, all the way dating back to the 8th century, that one. And sometimes, though, people would go and live happily in the other world, at other times they would return. And like Thomas, they would find that time had passed. Thomas stayed for 3 days. The Irish hero O'Sheen stayed for many years in fairyland. And when he came back, well, at least one legend says that when he set foot on the shore of Ireland again, he turned immediately into dust and was blown away as the passing of the centuries caught up with him. Now, the church really disapproved of people having relations with fairies and warned of the dire consequences. And I just thought I'd read you a little quote here from a 13th century text where a churchman is really trying to say, please do not have sex with fairies. Not because they don't exist, but because many a fool lies with them in woods and meadows, but everyone who does so pays the price for it. The members of some of them swell up, some scarcely break free, and some fade away and die. It was scary. That's what they were trying to say, at least. But, well, accounts from those who'd done it disagreed. The evidence of a man at a 17th century Scottish witch trial said that he'd slept many times with the Queen of Fairyland, and he'd had children with her. He got to visit them sometimes, and she'd given him many magical gifts. So he seemed to think it was pretty all right. For many women, the consequences were more about pregnancies, and often they were left with babies they couldn't explain except by a dalliance with the fairies, which was okay, because I'm sure everyone absolutely understood. Fairies are dangerous. Fairies are sexy. And even though it pains me a little to put this in, I have to say, fairies are kind of okay sometimes, actually. But this will be the shortest bit. And don't rely on it. Now, if you can remember back to the start, we go back to this Suffolk midwife who is called from her house in the middle of the night by a man she has not seen before. He is, of course, as you know now, and she is beginning to suspect he is a fairy. He takes her on his horse, he blindfolds her, and away they ride into the night. He tells her that his mistress, who needs her services, is the queen of the fairies herself. Eventually, the long journey stops. The midwife is let down off the horse, she is unblindfolded, and there in front of her is a quite plain cottage, actually. But she doesn't ask any questions. In she goes. And there is the queen of the fairies, a quite plain looking woman, but a quite plain looking woman who is struggling with her labor. And the midwife goes to work. She is the best. Hours pass. But after it all, the queen of the fairies has a newborn babe who is sleeping peacefully. She is ever so thankful to the midwife. She tells her that she will give her gold, gold as she has never had before. But before she goes, she asks one request. The midwife does as she is bid. She goes to a small box, opens it up, and finds it full of an ointment which she dabs on her fingers and then gently rubs on the baby's eyes. A ritual she's never known anything of the like, but she doesn't know much about fairies, so. And that's it. She's led outside the house by the man who deposits a huge amount of gold in her hand. And just before she's blindfolded, she turns to look back at the cottage. And as she does so, she rubs one eye with her finger, with the ointment still on it. And she finds that the cottage, with her left eye, the left eye which she did not rub, that sees a cottage, but the right eye sees a shining palace. Down the blindfold comes, she's back on the horse, and they're arriving back at the house just as the last chime of midnight dies away. And the midwife is left with more gold than she's ever had before, and she's going to make the whole community richer for it. Sometimes the fairies could be beneficial to know. So lots of accounts, lots of tales tell of the good things that the fairies do, often in return for some act of kindness by humans. They might clean your house with their magic. They might give fairy money to people in need. They might do farm work. They can spin and make garments or heal illnesses. They teach people music. We have tunes that are meant to have been taught by the fairies. They teach magic. And this is probably one of the most useful things. Cunning people, that is what we might call white witches as well, they were often learned magic by the fairies. And they do even stranger things as well. In one story, Robin Goodfellow is said to have been a sort of superhero who went around saving the poor from the evil rich by basically using his shape-shifting powers and causing a lot of mayhem along the way. As I say, I don't want to linger on this aspect of the fairies, but it is important. If you happen just about to get on the right side of them, they were very powerful and they could do good things for you. But despite that, they were mostly still dangerous. That there's a market. The market to which the midwife has gone a few weeks later to purchase provisions for her entire village with the gold she's got. And as she's there, perusing the stores, something odd she notices. She notices something odd. She notices a man who has a large bag and seems to be going around all the stalls, taking, but never paying. Just picks up a large fish, slings in the bag, takes some turnips, slings them in the bag. She watches this for a minute or two before, as he approaches another stall, going to nab a basket of apples, she cries out, "Thief!" Now, no one around her, none of the shopkeepers, the stall holders, they don't pay attention. And the man turns and he looks at her. And she suddenly feels like something's a little bit wrong here. You can see me, he says. With which eye do you see me? And the midwife, she reaches up to her right eye where she daubed that ointment. And that's enough for him. In one fluid, swift motion, the fairy man reaches up and plucks out her eye. She falls to the floor, screaming in agony, and she never sees the fairies again. So even if you get good things from them, you still might need some protection from the fairies. So those are my three big characteristics of fairies there, that they are dangerous. Have I made that clear? They can be pretty sexy and sometimes they can be good. But because of the danger, the last little bit of the talk I'm going to focus on is on protection from the fairies, because this was something that people really, really needed. Now, the best way to get protection from the fairies was by not drawing their attention to you in the first place. Seems pretty sensible. You can't always do it though, because they might just be cruel. But if you are going to, then here are some things you can think to do. First of all, don't say the word fairies, which I have made a bit of a mistake of here. But the fairies don't like being called fairies. They like nice names that make them appear good, even if we don't believe that they are. Call them the fair folk, the good neighbors, Doini Mahaj means the good people, or other euphemisms. They like that kind of thing. Flatter them a bit. Definitely don't trespass on areas that belong to them. In their trees and forts and paths, leave them well alone. You can generally try being polite and courteous to all strangers who could just be fairies. You can give offerings to the fairies. They like that. Leave out milk. Leave out the first of the corn, especially at certain times of year when the fairies are more common. And some particular fairies really like clean and tidy houses. So if you keep your house clean and tidy, you're less likely to attract the attention of those ones. Now, obviously, I said you can't actually guarantee they'll keep away from you. But if they don't, you might also want to think about some techniques to keep them away. One of the strangest of which, is to turn your clothes inside out while you're wearing them to confuse the fairies. And an account of this is found in New England in the 1780s, when it was still believed in. The most common, however, is probably iron, horseshoes above the door, lumps of iron left in children's bed to stop them being taken and replaced with changelings. It's not clear why, but the fairies hate iron. You can also use magical spells and Christian charms and spells as well. Bible verses wrapped up, shoved into pockets, or worn around the neck. The rosary is meant to be fairly effective against the fairies. Crosses, holy water, all that sort of thing tends to keep them away. If you're not so Christian, then, well, plants work too. Hazel, rowan, St. John's wort, nettles, fairies hate all of them. And then there's a huge amount of other things, the efficacy of which I can't really speak for, but things like hagstones, stones with a hole in them, fairy arrows, amber beads. Washing a child in urine is said to keep the fairies away, and other people too. So there's a lot of different means you can use that might or might not keep them away from you. If all else failed, consult a cunning person, or what's called a fairy doctor, local experts who could help cure fairy diseases, advise how to get people back from the fairies, and occasionally even advise how to fight them. Just one last slide to finish off with, though. So throughout this talk, I've talked about the fairies, and I've been not very specific about the sources that I'm drawing on here. I have talked about legends and folklore as if they're one thing. And I've mixed and matched my examples from them. But the fact is that, well, fairies are a very common character in legends, myths, and fictional stories that people told to their children, to each other, when we had a strong storytelling culture. But it's really important to realize that fairies, as I've just described them, not the small winged creatures, fairies were very much believed to be real by a lot of people, possibly the majority of people in Britain and Ireland over the last 2,000 years. If you think that's strange, consider that many things I've talked about, not all, but many things, are things that actually we see today. Your butter doesn't churn, the beer always it doesn't always froth, and it's not always clear why. But more seriously, sudden illnesses that disfigured people, they happen, and they're very hard to explain when they do. A healthy person struck down by a stroke. Children are born very disabled, were even more so in the past, and it was very easy to explain a very ill child as not being your own, but being a changeling. Plagues in animals, wasting diseases, severe mental health issues. I referred before to people, adults, who were said to be changeling, many of whom were probably suffering from onsets of what we would now recognize as severe mental illness. And of course, unexpected pregnancies always seem to crop up. Now, even today, when belief in the fairies has definitely died down, and the fairies have become these small winged creatures I've described before, some belief still persisted. This is a photo taken in 1912, which convinced many people, including a very famous author, that the fairies were real. And even in 2014, a census was carried out over 3 years, and the Fairy Investigation Society collected together over 500 recent fairy eyewitness experiences. In Chaucer's day, the fairies were disappearing, but they're still sort of disappearing now. And I'm just going to leave you with a verse that, if you think the fairies are cute and winged creatures, sounds very nice, very playful, written by a poet who is very well acquainted with the fairies himself. And if you think of the fairies, what I've just described to you now, this verse is rather more sinister. Come away, O human child, to the waters and the wild, with a fairy hand in hand, for the world's more full of weeping than you can understand. That's me. Any questions?
All right, groups that are tuned in, feel free to come off mute and ask some questions or feedback. That was fantastic. I loved all of the stories.
Excellent.
Oh. Okay. Oh,
If there
we've
are
got
no
a
questions,
quiet group here at the end.
okay,
Yeah.
that's fine.
That was really great. Thank you for doing that. I don't have a lot of I'm having trouble picturing popular depictions of fairies. The only thing that really pops to my mind are the Guillermo del Toro stuff. But which I love. I love Pan's Labyrinth and in Hellboy movies when fairies pop in and the fairy market and stuff. I get a kick out of all that. Do you have a favorite in popular or books, or what's your favorite story or depiction of fairies and stuff?
My favorite depict. I really like I mentioned Terry Pratchett, and Terry Pratchett is a I don't know how familiar people are with him. He's a British author who does a really good job of kind of mixing the old fairies in with the new, and he makes them, I would say, even more terrifying and cruel than they are in the old stories. And he's got a line I can't quote off the top of my head, but I should be able to, where he's talking about how people perceive them to be beautiful and glamorous because they've got this magic and they just look so great and fantastic. But actually at heart, he's like that. It's something along the lines of fairies are terrific. They beget terror. And I just really like that as a depiction of them. And his fairies are particularly the savage fairies. And while that's not quite how they all are, I love his depiction of the elves in his books. Some of my favorites.
Yeah, he's great. Thank you.
Libby, thanks for hanging around. Do you have any questions for Graeme or thoughts on the topic?
I don't have any questions. I'm still just shocked that fairies don't have wings, and I wonder where that came from.
So, I can talk about that for a little bit. It's a really debated topic. It's like an academic hot topic to find the earliest depiction of fairy wings. There are essentially two places that they come from. One of which is they get confused with the creatures from Greek mythology, pans and nymphs and stuff like that. But one of the key ones is actually on stage. So to show people were magical on stage, there was often a way of that you would dress people up in a certain costume. And at some point, wings became a bit of a stand-in for that. And it was used for other creatures called sylphs a bit before, I think. But then that became fairy, and then that was a very powerful image. And as the fairy belief that was real died away, you started to get all these shorthand images of fairies with wings. And when they got smaller as well, because there were some poets who just wrote about fairies, there's some fantastic Elizabethan poets who wrote these stories about fairies being tiny and with the insects. That also made sense, and that all comes together. And that there was like a place in society for these smaller fairies in children's books and stuff. And the older fairies were just seen as a bit backward, a bit rural, especially in the 19th and 20th centuries when people still definitely kept believing in the old kind of fairy. People who were writing books, Victorians, and that's who we're talking about here. They weren't happy really to be associated with that kind of fairy, but the other fairies with wings for children just fitted better, I think.
Very nice. That's really interesting. Because, you think of like Tinkerbell whenever you think of a little fairy flying around with her little pixie dust and all of that.
Yeah, and essentially, the way I try to see it is they are actually the words used for two creatures that are just completely different. Now, interestingly, people do say that they see the modern kind of fairies today. So that is what people see today. But you see this with other folkloric beings as well. It happens with vampires, being another key one who is, before Bram Stoker writes, and I suppose before Carmilla and a couple of other examples, certainly before 19th century Gothic literature, the vampire is just something completely different, mostly associated with disease and an actual walking hideous corpse a lot of the time. It's just not the same thing. And we've got these creatures today we think we get from folklore, but that actually come from somewhere else. And I do like that. And I think both are absolutely legitimate, and both are cool, basically. But you can talk about actually where it comes from and not confuse the two. I'm happy to take other questions, by the way, but also if that's it, if I've just blown you all away, I'm happy with that too. Okay, should I leave that there then?
I think so. Thank you so much for doing this.
No problem at all. If you want to go listen to my podcast, it's called Tales of Britain and Ireland, and I've got 50 odd episodes touching all kinds of topics, boggarts and giants and justified murder princesses mostly. Those are my favorite ones. So go check that out there.
Will do. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me, guys.
Thank you.
Bye.